Good afternoon, everybody. This is The Safety Net. I am Susan Howards, a local attorney who focuses on domestic violence in Brookline, and I am sitting in temporarily for Stephen Bressler. With me today, I'm delighted to have Sandy Lundy, also an attorney in Brookline, probate and family law. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you.
Sandy, how long have you been practicing law?
Since 1988, a long time.
And what is your background? How did you prepare to be a lawyer?
Well, at first, I actually have a doctorate in English literature from Columbia University. That actually prepared me very well to be a lawyer because it just gave me the structure that I needed to really help create arguments. I went to Yale Law School after I graduated from Columbia. And I've been working as an attorney, and now I have an office in Brookline, and I specialize in family law and appeals. I've been interested in domestic violence since my law school days. I wrote an article on it for my Yale Law Review, and I've been working in the field since then.
And what do you see in the family and probate courts now, as far as the number of cases that involve domestic violence? You do divorce and custody, the whole. What do you see now as opposed to 30 years ago?
Well, what I see now is that a lot more people are sensitive. Judges are more aware of domestic violence. And then you have some rogue actors who try to use a domestic violence claim either to get a one-up on custody or for some other reason. I think the judges are savvy to that. I think they understand the dynamics of domestic violence. There's a lot more training than there was 30 years ago. There's just a lot more training across the board. But I can't say that every case has merit, and that's really a shame because the cases that are strategic really weigh down the cases that have merit, and
When you say strategic, you mean when they're using domestic violence as a way to get something from the other side that
right.
isn't really there?
That's right. That's right.
And weren't you involved in the Framingham 8?
Yes, I was. I represented Deborah Reed, who was the only victim of same-sex domestic violence.
And how did that go?
Her sentence was cut short by 2 years. She is now living in Virginia. With her family, she's doing very, very well. It was an uphill battle to get people to understand domestic violence in the same-sex community, to understand that it exists, to understand that she had a meritorious case. The judge who presided at her trial basically said, "I don't believe in same-sex domestic violence," in so many words. So it was an educational moment, I think, for a lot of people. And Deborah was very strong, very courageous woman to go forward.
So were you, as the attorney?
Not as much as she was.
Not as she was. How common is same-sex domestic violence today?
Well, one of the issues is there aren't any really good statistics. There aren't any really good studies. There are far fewer studies on same-sex domestic violence as there are on opposite-sex domestic violence. In general, the statistics are that about 35% of heterosexual women say they're victims of domestic violence, and 43% of lesbian or bisexual women, 26% of gay men, and 29% of heterosexual men. But it really doesn't tell you anything, because it could be that the women, the lesbians who were asked, are just more open about more willing to acknowledge that violence is in the relationship. So the research is really lagging behind.
Why is that, Sandy?
Why the research?
Yeah, why is the research lagging?
Well, I think just because the general awareness of same-sex domestic violence is lagging the awareness of heterosexual domestic violence. I will say that the Violence Against Women Act does have funding for promoting research and services to same-sex clients, which is great, and another reason that act should be refunded.
And it hasn't been as of yet.
Not as of yet, but I think for the same reason that gay research into gay people or research into any minorities lag behind research into white males. It's just almost a cultural bias.
Interesting. How is same-sex domestic violence different from opposite-sex domestic violence? And is it?
Well, I want to say that there are a lot of dynamics that are, the dynamics are the same.
What does that mean?
That means that we're talking about issues of power and control. That's what domestic violence is. That is across the board.
Right.
Economic violence, physical violence, verbal violence, the isolation of the victim, all of that dynamic is the same, but the specifics may be different. For instance, gay people, if they're in the closet, a batterer can use the threat of outing their partner as a means of power and control.
Okay.
If somebody's afraid to go to the police because they perceive the police as being biased against gay people, or somebody will use as a structure of control, I'm going to out you to your employer. So homophobia is used as a tool of power and control very frequently in same-sex relationships.
But the power and control is the structure is the same, but the internal machinations of the structure is different. Am I understanding that correct?
Yeah, well, the nature of the threat is different. Yeah, instead of, I'm going to leave you and you won't have any money, it's I'm going to leave you and you won't have any money and I'm going to tell your boss that you're gay and you're going to get fired.
So it's the outing that's the extra level.
Right.
Or one of the extra levels.
One of the extra levels, and the other is the fear among victims of same-sex domestic violence that they won't be believed or they won't get help. And there's a lot of stereotyping that goes on behind that. For instance, two guys fighting in a domestic violence situation can often be dismissed as boys being boys, or two women who are in a domestic violence situation, well, that's just a cat fight. It's just between women. It's not really domestic violence. So there's a lot of stereotyping that has to get overcome before somebody gets credibility.
Are there any organizations that are working on that where somebody who's in a same-sex domestic violence situation could reach out to?
We are so fortunate in Boston and in Massachusetts. We have the network La Red, which deals with victims of same-sex domestic violence, including transgender domestic violence, which is another layer of threatening, intimidating behaviors that can happen. We have the Fenway Victim Recovery Project. We have the Gay Men's Domestic Violence Project, and most of the general domestic violence organizations in Massachusetts, Jane Doe and others, are now very sensitive to issues of same-sex domestic violence.
And how about judges in the probate court?
Judges
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No. I love all judges in the probate court.
Okay.
Judges actually have been trained specifically on the dynamics of same-sex domestic violence. If you look at the judicial guidelines for domestic violence, there's instructions and guidance for judges in assessing same-sex domestic violence. The tendency in a court, if they see two people of the same sex in an altercation, is to say, well, it's a mutual battering, and not to look further than that. So there's been a really concerted effort by the trial court to educate judges, and not just judges, police personnel, district attorneys, that you can't dismiss these cases. You need to listen to both sides, and you need to listen very carefully for what's being said and what the dynamics are.
Do they understand it? I think it would depend on the police department. I know Brookline does, because they're extremely well trained and they're very savvy.
Yeah.
But I think it would depend on where you are and which. I would assume the farther you go from an urban area, this is what I found in criminal law, the less understanding they have, number one, of restraining orders, of domestic violence, and the DAs aren't quite as, I don't want to say sympathetic or empathic or open to these kinds of issues. Have you found that in probate courts?
Well, most of my practice is in Boston, Norfolk, Essex, places where I would expect the judges
to be savvy.
I know everybody gets the same training. The judges all go to a convention, but whether training sticks, I think, is always an individual issue.
What about children of same-sex couples involved in domestic violence situations? Have you had experience with that?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about it without revealing any?
Well, I think that I think a lot of cases it's the same. The same issues pertain. What's in the best interest of the children? Is it in the best interest of the children to have one parent have sole custody, to have both parents share custody but meet at a police department? To have, so each situation is a little bit different, but the things that the court are most concerned about, one, they're concerned about, are the children being harmed? And they make an assumption that any time for any child in any domestic violence situation, that any time a child witnesses domestic violence, that's harm. That's harmful to the child, and the judge has to make findings on that. And then, they're also concerned of, what is the best custodial arrangement. Sometimes even if there is domestic violence, the court will make a determination that it's in the best interest of the children for them to go, or them to have joint custody with the person who's alleged to be the abuser, just because maybe they make better decisions, maybe they are not involved with substances. So the focus is always on what's best for the children. It's not it's not about punishing domestic violence so much as what do we need to do to protect the kids.
What kind of treatment is there for, say, the batterer in a same-sex situation? We have limited treatments, at least in the criminal justice system, for batterers treatment. Is there anything comparable? Or is it the same? Are they sent to the same treatment that, say, heterosexual domestic violence batterers would be sent?
No, frankly, I'm not exactly sure about all of the resources that are available. There have been some programs for same-sex abusers. They've had limited success so far as I'm aware, and what's current right now, I couldn't tell you.
Have you had any experience with domestic violence in the trans community?
No, but I had an experience that tells me a lot about how difficult it is. Yeah, I was doing a divorce case, and the couple that were getting divorced, there was a transition from male to female, so there were two women in front of the judge, and that actually wasn't the reason that they were getting divorced. They just were getting divorced for other reasons. But I was in a courtroom where the judge always says something nice to the divorcing parties, especially if they entered into a joint agreement. Well, here the judge kept his head down the entire time, didn't say anything to the couple, and I really felt bad for them because they were two lovely people. They deserved the same kind of nice words that everybody else did, but the judge just viscerally couldn't deal with the fact
With the
that
trans.
one of the parties had transitioned.
Did they know that they were being treated differently by the judge, or did you know?
I
only
wasn't
'cause
going to tell
no,
them.
I understand.
I knew.
But and other attorneys in the courtroom probably
They
knew.
probably
but
did,
hopefully
too.
the parties didn't know.
I hope not. But the fact that I knew, I mean, I just felt hurt for them. I just felt hurt for that couple because they deserved what the judge did for everybody
Normally.
else.
But
Yeah.
do you think it will change as more and more trans, I don't know how to say this, more and more trans stories come out and we're made more aware? I know it's really, I've had trans clients, very tough.
Yeah.
Not just for those involved, but for the families, for the friends. It's almost like a ripple effect when you're throwing a stone in the
Right.
water, and
Yeah.
it just multiplies. And it's really, really, really hard as an attorney to keep your distance and to be legal
Yeah.
and not be empathic or emotional, because
Yeah.
you just can't be. But it seems to me that just like with domestic violence, whether it's same-sex or heterosexual, the more we know, the better we'll be able to deal with it in a way that's civil, respectful, and supportive.
Yeah,
I hope.
I think that we're at a time when when there's more gender fluidity, when there's beginning to be more acceptance of different sexual expressions like polyamory, and eventually those issues will, rise to the point where people understand that they really need to be educated to assess what's really going on, particularly if there's domestic violence.
It would seem that law schools in divorce and family law, I don't know if you know this, and I don't, I haven't checked with my own law school, that they would be incorporating same-sex domestic violence in the family law courses, or trans cases in the family law courses, that they would be at least mentioning it to the young lawyers who are, or not necessarily young, because I went to law school very late, to the lawyers who are graduating. Do you know anything of how they're dealing with it, or the Women's Bar Association, or the bar associations in general?
I went to law school as a second career too, and the way that my courses were structured, domestic violence was a separate course.
Wow.
Family law, there was a little bit of instruction about domestic violence, but it was mainly custody, property division, those kinds of issues. So, but I think that law schools are places where people are very open to the issue of same-sex domestic violence. Yeah.
One last question. I'm really concerned with treatment, if there is treatment, and I'm not sure there is treatment for domestic violence. I don't know how we get on the other side of it. I think we've made progress. We haven't made enough progress. The cases that I'm seeing are much more rigorous, more physical, more focused between the parties than what I saw 30 years ago when I started with the Framingham 8. So I'm wondering, what suggestions would you have for sort of calming people down who are involved in domestic violence? And I don't know if we can do that.
Well, this is going to sound pie in the sky, but you've got to start. I'm hopeful that all of these anti-bullying initiatives in schools are really going to help in the long run. You have to teach respect for other people young. You can't take somebody who spent 30 years, either feeling disrespected or feeling that they can step on people, and all of a sudden expect them to change. So really, I think that you need a concerted education for younger people, that certain things just aren't okay to do to other people.
But we've had that, Sandy. We've had that for a long time. And do you see a change in your practice, in numbers of domestic violence cases, in severity, in people being reluctant, particularly in same-sex, reluctant to come and get a restraining order, for example, because they're afraid?
I don't see a greater intensity of the actual battering. I do see more willingness to come forward because people know they can touch base with GLAAD. They can gay and lesbian advocates and defenders. They can touch base with Fenway. I mean, even if you don't know that much about same-sex domestic violence and you find yourself in the situation, you almost can figure out which are the agencies that that will help you. And I know at one point there was an initiative to put domestic violence help information in gay bars and lesbian bars, and I don't know if that still is going on today. I would imagine that it is. So
But
there's outreach.
even if same-sex victims went to a regular domestic violence agency, they would get help.
They would.
So,
Yeah.
So the services that are available to everyone are not secluded from same-sex or trans.
Right, like take a hospital, okay? Hospitals have domestic violence protocols. It used to be that when two women came in, you know, well, let them be in the same room. But now I think doctors and nurses are trained that if two women came in and looks like somebody got a black eye, you talk to one person in one room and the other person in another room. So I think that the hospitals have done a great job with that. The police are much more aware than they used to be. I mean, if we look at where we were 30 years ago and where we are now, it's really, you know, it's a whole new positive world.
In some areas.
But
we still have to deal with trans getting the same treatment as everybody else.
Yeah.
And that is, I think that's a monumental task as far as education.
Right.
No bullying and just acceptance. Acceptance.
You know, there's something else I should say in terms of domestic violence and you know, transphobia, etc., and homophobia. There was for a long time an institutional reluctance in the gay community to discuss issues of same-sex domestic violence because the feeling was we have so many people against us that we don't essentially want to air our dirty laundry in public. I think, you know, you might see a little bit of that, you know, in other communities as well. But
ethnic and religious communities.
Yeah.
Particularly in Boston.
So that can serve as you know, so the institutional help that you would expect to get, you wouldn't get. But I think that barrier, at least for gay and lesbian and bisexual people, has really been overcome. It's really been knocked down. For people who are transsexual, I think that barrier some of that barrier might still be there.
If you had one thing to say to our audience, one last thing, what would it be?
It would be, if you need help, get help. There's help that's available. There's even just saying something to a friend, just making a safety plan. There is help. There are lots of people who want to help you. It's really hard to make the first step. I would never minimize how hard it is, but if you make that first step, you'll find that there are people who will be there to get you on that good road.
And Sandy, if they wanted to reach you, how would they reach you?
I am at Sandy, that's S-A-N-D-Y, at lundylegal.com, L-U-N-D-Y, legal.com, and my office number is 617-274-5742. I'm happy to speak with anybody about these issues.
Sandy, thank you so much
You're
for coming
welcome.
today.
Thank you
Thanks
for
for the
inviting
work that
me.
you do.
Oh, well, thank you.